Good evening. It's another episode, another live episode of The Left Lens. This is Danny Dhaiphong. As always, um, letting YouTube come on. It looks like I am now live on YouTube. As you're coming in, please do like the stream. Of course, you know the drill. Like the stream to boost the algorithm. Hit that subscription button. Hit the notifications bell. And of course, do support this work at patreon.com/Danny Dhaiphong. We have a lot to talk about tonight. It is a late evening stream. Hello, everyone. So for the first portion, I'm actually going to be joined by, I'm going to bring them on now. I'm going to be joined by Amira. She is a journalist, a Palestinian-American journalist who has just formed the YouTube channel, The Endemic Times. And that is in the description of this video. So definitely check it out after we depart here. And she's going to join me. I'm going to bring her on right now as we talk about Joe Biden's visit to Israel recently. He visited from July 13th to the 15th. And right after that, Israel started bombing Gaza. So we have a lot to talk about. And I'm going to bring her on now. Hi, Amira. How are you?
Hi, Danny. I'm doing really well. How are you?
Good, good, good. It's good to be with you. Thanks for coming on short notice. I thought I needed to bring someone on who could talk about this with me. I haven't talked about Palestine enough, I feel like, on this channel. So it's good to be with you this evening. So, yeah, first off, would you like to just tell people more about yourself first? And then I want to pull up the clip because I think this is an important clip. I want to talk about Biden's trip to Israel. But first, please do give any information you'd like about who you are.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. So my name is Amira. I'm a YouTube host and journalist for Endemic Times. I started this endeavor right during the pandemic when it started because, like a lot of people, I lost my job. So I wanted to put my skills to some good use. And with Endemic Times, I talk a lot about different political aspects, cultural issues. I do some investigatory pieces. And most recently, I have published or put out on my YouTube channel, Endemic Times, a series about the impending food crisis and how that is affecting a lot of the marginalized and disenfranchised countries, specifically Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia. These are countries we just don't see in the mainstream media a whole lot. And that's where a lot of my focus is trying to find the areas that mainstream media doesn't really want to talk about and bringing that to people so that they can get that information themselves.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you for that work, and I think that this topic is perfect for what you're getting into. Joe Biden, as I said, visited Israel or visited colonized, occupied Palestine, and this visit comes off the heels of a huge crisis right now for the Biden administration. He really went over there for many different reasons. But Joe Biden, in his trip to Israel, said a lot of things. He said a lot of things in the media that I think are important to highlight. And I wanted to focus on this one clip from Channel 12 News, in the Israel so-called Channel 12 News. Most U.S. presidents go on this when they make trips to Israel. They kind of grill the U.S. presidents about their positions. It's kind of like a litmus test almost. Like, how much do you support us really? And
Yes.
so Joe Biden had really interesting words, and I think they're interesting for so many reasons. But for one, they're just really direct, and they're definitely targeting a specific a group of people who criticize Israel, and they happen to be within his own party. So it's not I don't think it's the smartest move, but we know that Joe Biden hasn't really cared about what Democratic Party voters like, or anyone
Yeah.
what they like. So let's listen to what he had to say when he was asked by Channel 12 News in Israel why, or like what. Just let's just watch the clip. He's asked what is this? How can he explain the gap between himself, his administration, and the feelings of some in the Democratic Party who criticize Israel. Here's what he had to say.
You were really at the forefront, sir, of pushing for military and security assistance for Israel. We should note that the Obama-Biden administration oversaw the approval of the Iron Dome. But there are also other voices in the Democratic Party, sir, voices that say that Israel is an apartheid state, calling for an end of unconditional aid. There's an undeniable gap between you and those voices.
There are a few of them. I think they're wrong. I think they're making a mistake. Israel is a democracy. Israel is our ally. Israel is a friend. And I think that I make no apologies. We've provided for my administration $4 billion plus another billion for Iron Dome. And we're working on a laser project to be able to replace Iron Dome. It's overwhelming our interest that Israel be stable.
But if even an issue like interceptors for the Iron Dome is a controversial thing, should be concerned for the future of the relationship between Israel and the Democratic Party.
No, there's no possibility, I think, of the Democratic Party or even a significant portion of the Republican Party walking away from Israel.
All right, that's Joe Biden. Strong words from Joe Biden about his loyalty to Israel. First, Amir, any reaction to that? With the understanding that not 24 hours later, Israel was conducting airstrikes on Gaza. That's the latest breaking news coming out of Palestine. So Amir, any reactions to this?
I mean, of course, it's frustrating. A lot of the rhetoric that comes from Biden when it comes to the state of Israel and his two-state solution that he has been discussing, it comes from a bit of, in my opinion, some disingenuousness, because you can say that Israel, the area that is considered the state of Israel, is a democracy, but it doesn't mean that the entire region is led in a democratic way. The state of Israel is inflicting oppressive tactics onto the Palestinian people. And that is why it is making it so difficult for anyone to come to the table and have a semblance of peace talks or mediation between these two parties, because they are not equal. And that's where I get really frustrated, just kind of in general, when it comes to discussing the Palestinian issue, because these are not two equal entities that are trying to vie for power and statehood in this region. The Palestinians have been pushed down for the last 74 years since the state of Israel was created by the United States and also by the European Union. So it feels very disingenuous to me to say that Israel is this democracy when you can say that maybe of the actual place that the Israelis are ruling and have their people that they provide healthcare for. They are building more and more settlements on Palestinian land that is considered to be a violation of so many different resolutions. And it just feels so disingenuous to act like this is a democracy when the whole reason why the state of Israel exists is because of the billions of dollars that the United States is funneling into the state of Israel, because they are using Israel as a proxy state for the United States in the Middle East. And that's why they have to continue to perpetuate all of this rhetoric that is calling anyone that goes against the oppression that the Palestinian people are experiencing, they're immediately called anti-Semitic, when it has nothing to do with the religion. It has to do with the Zionist, very far right wing of the Jewish state and the Zionist regime that is present right now.
Oh, for sure. I mean, these comments felt like really a veiled attack on the BDS movement and essentially on everyone inside and outside of the Democratic Party that criticizes Israel and that has anything negative to say. And it's always interesting to hear Israel being called a democracy. It's usually the United States and, of course, its junior partners in Europe that have this obsession with doing this. Not even the junior partners out in the Arab world will do anything like this, right? Because that would be absolutely just a total, just a complete violation of of what people there think about Israel and a complete PR disaster. But of course, for the West and the United States in particular, which, as you said, pumps billions in military aid, and Biden was bragging about that. Oh yeah, more for the Iron Dome. We're going to give more to the Iron Dome. We are going to renew that 3.8 billion. It'll probably be increased. I'm sure it'll be increased in some capacity. 3.8 billion per year. That's going to be renewed. And so what's so interesting about Israel being called a democracy is that, yeah, it is a quote unquote democracy if we go by the definition of how democracy is defined by the United States, which is basically any colonial entity that reflects or represents the interests of the United States and of the Western imperial powers. It is a democracy for the rich. And of course, it is a racist and colonial democracy, which only serves the colonialists. That's how Israel operates. Israel, yes, has a vibrant democracy for those who identify as Zionists and who want to be able to occupy the land and be able to settle, quote unquote, there. And for Palestinians, though, it's in another story entirely.
Exactly, and they don't have freedom of movement. There are so many blockades when it comes, especially when you look at Gaza. I mean, this is an area that has been blockaded and is basically considered like an open air prison and especially with the horrendous conditions that they're experiencing there. But in general, just the Palestinian people in I still call it Palestine, but people are going to say that that's anti-Semitic, so Israel. But one of the things that is, I think, by far the saddest part of this is that when you look at the billions of dollars that the U.S. has sent to Israel for the Iron Dome, and then you look at the conflicts that always happen between Hamas and the Israeli forces, there's always this want or desire from the Israeli side to look at the rockets are being sent as like they're equal, like this is an equal warfare kind of thing. And it's just not. And that is where I think a lot of people, not just Palestinians within the region or outside, there is a huge movement of people that I really do greatly appreciate that are talking about these atrocities that are being inflicted on the Palestinian people because of this inability to have freedom of movement. Israelis inciting a lot of violence towards Palestinians. And whether we want to like it or not, Hamas is generally responding to Israeli aggression. And I'm not saying that I don't condone the deaths that happen on either side, but I do think that we have to understand that these are not equal parties going against each other. The Israeli forces are $1 billion military complex, and the Palestinians are getting the little bit that they get and are trying to have a semblance of some say and some control. We might not like that, but that's just kind of the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, the death toll is astronomical. I mean, it's just astronomical from just the humanitarian crisis, which has been created by that just absolutely devastating blockade, the levels of unemployment, and then, of course, these bombing campaigns, which do tend to just turn into all-out war, right? I mean, 2008, 2014, Protective Edge. I mean, it's like it's usually a massacre, and it's usually so one-sided that you have thousands of Palestinians killed, and then generally you'll have a couple dozen, maybe, overall. I think the differences in the death toll between Palestinians and Israelis, quote unquote, are are like 10, 15, 20 to 1 oftentimes. I mean, there's just no comparison. And I think you're completely right. The United States has worked hand in foot for decades with Israel to destroy any semblance of a so-called secular Arab resistance in that region in particular, and in Palestine specifically. And so Hamas is like the armed resistance that's left in Palestine that has any kind of militant organization that stands up to Israel, whether we like their politics or not. That's just the reality on the ground.
And that's also something that kind of echoes to what we're seeing with people that are in full support of the Ukrainians and what's happening with them with Russia. And that's where it's like, okay, if you want to support what the Ukrainians are doing in wanting to maintain their sovereignty, I can completely understand that sentiment. It's then, okay, are you going to apply that same sentiment to the Palestinian people? Or are you going to look at what's happening in Yemen and Ethiopia and Libya and Syria? Because these are all areas that are dealing with the decades and decades and decades worth of colonial intervention going on in the region. And so I think the Ukraine Russia tensions is, I think, helping to kind of spur this conversation that we've been needing to have, not just when it comes to Palestine and the apartheid and the oppression and the genocide that is going on there, but how other Black and brown countries and nations are being treated by the US and outside forces, and the precipitous effects on their infrastructure, their economy, and their livelihoods, and how just devastating any type of war is. Like, I used to think that the US was trying to be, the peacemakers, because that's kind of what they would purport themselves to be. But the unfortunate situation is that they're not. They want to go in, they want to colonize, they want to have coups, and they want to insert leaders that they can control or puppeteer in some ways. And that's just what I hope that people can kind of take from this current moment in time as we discuss the Palestinians and the situation that they're in. And
Yeah.
there was just one other point I wanted to make, going back to Biden's statement about the people within his Democratic Party that, might at times have some tension or unwillingness to want to support Israel. As we've seen, like specifically with the progressives and the squad, there's a lot of performative theater there. They like to sometimes say the right things to the Palestinian people and acknowledging their plight, but we still have progressives and people in the squad that do not want to acknowledge BDS, that think that that's not an adequate role or way to go about showing your sentiment towards the state of Israel. And it's leaving people with no other non-combative action that they can take. And they ultimately, even progressives, have allowed this funding to go through. And the fact that they can't even just take a stance on that, it's like these bills are going to pass whether they say yes or not. But the fact that they're still having to placate to their higher ups and not put that no vote on, it just shows performative theater and a lot of disingenuous behavior, in my opinion, from the progressives. Because if they truly meant what they said, then they would actually take action by, at the very least, voting no.
Yo, that's definitely definitely true. I mean, it feels like the squad, Bernie Sanders, they ride the wave. A lot of credit is often given to them for making a shift in the politics overall on,
Mhm.
I don't even want to call them the left, but
Yeah.
on the Democratic Party side of the aisle, in terms of the constituency, there has been a shift in public opinion. It's often credited because of their visibility, especially in the last several elections with AOC and Bernie Sanders making certain statements, but it's the work of people who have worked really hard on college campuses,
Mhm.
all in communities, organizing protests, responding, educating. These are the people who they don't get the visibility, but it's really to their credit why there's been even any kind of, as you said, like performative, uh, uh, pandering to this issue. And what is so striking, and I want to pull up something now. What is really striking about what Biden said, because it's such a veiled attack on anyone who criticizes Israel. However, it really does attack a large section of the Democratic Party's constituency at this point, because at this point, more than more than 2/3 of Democrats want the United States to support Palestine more. But everything that Biden says is not about supporting Palestine. It's all about Israel. It's about how people who criticize Israel are incorrect and wrong, but you can't disassociate the two. Those who want to see more support for Palestine generally have criticisms of Israel's policies and what they do, in the region. And then I want to pull up something that's very interesting in my opinion, which is that most people who consider themselves Democrats don't even consider Israel really to be an ally of the United States. So Middle East Eye reported, I think this was last year. No, this was 3 months ago. This was in April of this year. Fewer than 1% of US Democrats. So these are people who are ostensibly in the Biden camp, no matter where they fall on the spectrum, do not view Israel as a top ally. So fewer than 1% of US Democrats view Israel as a top ally. So UK, Canada, Germany, Mexico, France, Japan, South Korea, and China, surprisingly enough, all rated higher among Democratic Party voters, according to a University of Maryland survey. So this was just 3 months ago that this was reported on. The poll found that 0.5% of Democratic respondents saw Israel as a first choice US ally, while 0.9% found Israel a second choice. So nobody even thinks in the Democratic Party, this isn't to say that the Democratic Party voters are some kind of anti-imperialist or pro-Palestinians, but there's obviously discontent. There's obviously problems with the relationship among Democratic Party voters. So for someone who has an approval rating of 30% right now, someone who's in a lot of trouble politically, November is 4 months away, less than that, when the results are finally tallied. So we have an election 4 months away for the midterms. And then you have all these questions about Joe Biden and his legitimacy as president. To me, it's just, I could have seen Obama make a much different. I don't think Barack Obama would have made a statement like that. He would say each of these things. I don't think he would make a statement like that so veiled but yet so direct toward the very people who are about to vote for his party and then about to kind of make a judgment call on his administration in a few months.
I mean, Joe Biden is an extremely aggressive and combative individual. In a lot of the interviews I've seen, especially when we saw him on the campaign trail in 2020, reporters just kind of asking him, simple, basic questions, he would get very, very aggressive with them. And then also with like Charlemagne, that was where that whole "you ain't black" comment, if you don't vote for Joe Biden, came through. He really doesn't like to have his pride pricked in any possible way. And I think that that's just been really evident to, I think, all of the Americans, but I think especially Democratic voters. And it doesn't surprise me that the amount of people within the Democratic Party don't see Israel as a true ally. And I think that that's for two reasons. I think it's partially because we give them so much money, so many funds, and especially in moments like right now, where the US is perfectly fine sending billions of dollars to Israel, millions of dollars to Ukraine, but the American people are struggling with inflation and high grocery costs. Rent costs are skyrocketing, which we were talking about before we started this. And people are just really feeling everything that has happened for the last 2 years, because this is hitting us in every possible way that it could. And then the second part of it is that Israel is not going to be an ally to the United States when our economy falls, because it most likely will. And I've always thought that Israel is perfectly fine taking as much money and infrastructure and military intelligence that they can to build themselves up. But it's like, as soon as they find a country that's going to provide them with more, they are going to flip on the United States. And I think that's why it's like people know that, they can feel that in a sense. And I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic. This has nothing to do with the Jewish people and followers of the faith. This is about the Zionist regime in Israel that is conducting these apartheid and genocidal acts against the Palestinians and using US funds to do that. Because one of the things is, like, the Israelis have universal health care. We don't have that here. And the reason why they have that there is because they get so much money from the United States. Palestinians will like not have access to water and electricity for sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours in the day, and they have to have water catchments on top of their on top of their homes, while the Israeli settlements are just filled and lush with greenery and water and electricity and stuff like that. So it's just we're funding an ally that's not really an ally, that's creating so much tension within the United States because people are seeing the disparity in how we treat our citizens here versus abroad, and it's just feeling like it's going to continue to get worse, especially with Biden being in such a cognitive decline and incapable of making real change at a time when we really need it.
Oh yeah, no, I mean you're exactly right. And a few things. First, I want to make a correction. I said something like the disparities between Israeli deaths or Palestinian deaths and Israeli deaths in these military operations that Israel has conducted is something like 20 to 1. Well, in Operation Protective Edge, I think 2,200 Palestinians died and 72 Israelis died. So way higher. And people in the chat were saying that. So yes, the disparity is way higher than 20 to 1. So we should not make an underestimate about that. So that was my bad. But from what you were saying, though, I mean, that's exactly right. And you mentioned earlier Ukraine and this whole idea of, well, Ukraine is a sovereign country. So if you want to support its sovereignty, I get that. It's just always so interesting how, quote unquote, democracy and sovereignty for the United States is always supported in one way, which is just militarizing the situation rather than coming to any kind of diplomatic and negotiated solution, which is what most of the rest of the world believes is the only way you can ever respect sovereignty or quote unquote democracy. You can't do that if you are creating a situation of endless war, which is what the United States has done in Ukraine. And it's what the United States has done with respect to Palestine and its Israeli Zionist occupiers. Like that's what the United States has done. So you're exactly right. And about Israel's allyship to the United States, it's true. It is not anti-Semitic to say that Israel is not a reliable ally. There are many instances where Israel is not considered just like some kind of lapdog to the United States. There is a really complex relationship. Just look at what happened in 1967 in the heat of this Arab war on Arab nationalism that was being led by Israel. Israel bombed the USS Liberty, a US submarine, like destroyed it. I mean, that was terrible. And of course, Lyndon Johnson was like, "Oh, well, we're just gonna paint over that because Israel is so valuable." But there is no doubt that, just like any other imperialist and colonial power, no matter how much unification and in terms of interests there are between them, there are divergences, right? Israel has plans to, kind of be the top dog in that region, and the U.S. has plans to use Israel to continue to be the top kind of occupier in that region. And that doesn't always go together, and so it makes sense that even in that most crass sense, just thinking about them as two separate kind of entities rather than just one singular kind of force moving together, there are issues there. And that's why you have media like Channel 12 News and Israeli media saying, hey, are you with us? Like, why, I always find that so interesting that top, kind of the top propagandists, no matter where across the Israeli media scene, they're always throwing out litmus tests for the United States. It doesn't matter how much money they get, how much they kind of run on U.S. military support. It's never enough. It's never enough because there is this tension. Because one thing that's sort of looks really bad for the United States, which has been a kind of a I think, a long-standing policy of the United States. The U.S. never wants to be considered an occupying power, a colonial power. It never wants that identity. It's tried to avoid that identity since it became the number one so-called superpower. It's always tried to do anything it can to avoid that public relations nightmare. Now, Israel has not done anything to avoid that. It has done everything to create the situation that it's in right now, which is increasingly unpopular in much of the world, and now even much of the population of American Jews, a lot of American Jews in the Democratic Party. They're not so happy with kind of being associated with what are undeniable atrocities.
That's a really fantastic point. And I, I will admit, like when I was really young and struggling after 9/11, because I was dealing with a lot of racism and discrimination because I was open about being Arab and open about being Palestinian American. I didn't have the best, relationships with fellow people that I knew that were Jewish. But over the years, as I educated myself and had more friends that were Jewish and even family members and things like that, I started to see that no, this isn't about Jews and Palestinians. This is about Zionism going against the Palestinians. And I had to take that journey and learn that for myself. And I think that more Arabs and Palestinians that can do that and understand that difference, I think is important, even though I do know that it's really difficult. But I can also understand how Jews here in the United States are feeling because I think that it's signifying a part of an area that they look at as their homeland, their motherland, and also associated with their religion to some degree. And so they don't want to be associated with these horrendous acts. And there's even been very prominent rabbis that have attended protests here in the US that are talking about pro-Palestinian relations and ending this Zionist regime. And these rabbis will speak to the teachings of the Torah and the teachings in their books and how they want to be associated with their faith and not with Zionism, and showing that they have support to the Palestinian people. And that's been a really beautiful thing to see, this kind of coalition coming between Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and the Jews that are all very diverse coming together. And I have a lot of hope for the future. I just hope that that is something that can start being looked at when it comes to the Democratic establishment party, because we do know that there's a lot of financial ties that are going on in the background. There's a lot of, establishment aspects in the Democratic Party that have a lot of say and a lot of sway on how things are being conducted within the party, the policies that are being put forward. And we see that even when it comes to these professors at universities that are having to sign these statements that they're not going to, do anything like BDS, and that's considered anti-Semitic to do that. And I think that that's also another area that people are trying to bring a light to say this is extreme. This is putting a very negative eye on an entire group of people that aren't the reason why this is happening. It's a very small selective group of like far right-wing fringe Zionism that's just been kind of allowed to flourish in Israel.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the ways in which the power that this force is Zionism is a far right ideology. Well, and while it may be dominant in what is called Israel, right? Certainly what's happened is it feels like that has been allowed to become the hegemonic ideology that represents all of Judaism in the so-called West, right? Like that, I think that's been the biggest problem for so many decades. What's encouraging from what you're saying, though, is that this narrative, this kind of dominance that Israel has had in the court of public opinion has eroded. You've seen Norman Finkelstein and all kinds of folks talk about this and document it, that this is eroding. The rise of BDS is just one expression of that. And the attack on BDS, and then, of course, the attack on anybody, Biden literally pointing at them on Israel's media saying, that you are few and you are wrong. That fact that he even feels like he has to say that, I think, is a testament to the level of concern that the U.S. establishment, the foreign policy establishment, and of course their hangers on in Israel, what their concerns are pretty large right now. And so the repression, I think, is only going to get worse because politics. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is one of the things that's so interesting. Is politics in the United States is not going to get any more stable. Politics in Israel, the Knesset, whatever they call it, that usually has a lot of stability because it's very silent. It's very how can you say, there's no opposition inside
Mhm.
of that state. It is literally a colonial state where only colonial the Zionist uh, forces are allowed in it. And this is what happens when you try to create a small fanatic kind of colonial state, is you have very little range of politics within it and very little range of politics in the society. But you do have around the world, most people, most countries that have any conscience at all, and even Europe, any country, they don't support what Israel does,
Mhm.
and that is becoming a problem that I think will continue to trouble not just Biden, but every single administration from here on out, and the U.S. political system from here on out.
Yeah, I agree. I had something come up in my head as you were talking. The one of the gaffes that Biden did while he was in Israel was talking about Shireen Abu Akleh and his inability to even like say her full name, and he sounded like he was going to say like Al Qaeda when he said that, and it really upset the family. And it's one of those things where it's a continuation of the perpetuation of stereotypes that we have here in the United States when it comes to the Arab people, and they're almost always depicted as these very very dark features, and they're terrorists and they're degrading to women and things like that. And to me, it's like Biden, in a lot of what he says and how he acts to the Palestinian people versus the Israeli government, kind of shows that prejudice. And I do think that he is extremely racist, not just to Palestinians. He does not like a lot of people. um, and he's just very disrespectful and rude, and that really kind of showed in his trip this week, because when you can't acknowledge that an American journalist in Palestine was killed by the Israeli forces, like the White House continues to not even want to acknowledge that. They're just trying to say, oh, it was an accident. um, and it just kind of showed how similar Israel and the United States are, because Israel will kill a journalist and nothing happens. And the United States, we want to extradite Julian Assange. And look at, he's still going to Saudi Arabia and with Mohammed bin Al Salman. And he was part of the Khashoggi killing, and this was another journalist. And it's just, there's a lot of, I think, just disrespectful, discriminatory acts that Biden has towards the Arab people in general, and it shows in his mannerisms and in his demeanor. And it's like, if you challenge him at all, he cannot handle it, and he just kind of goes into like a snowflake moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, snowflake, it's funny. The term snowflake is so often I love the term, not because of how the right usually uses it. They
Yeah,
usually
no.
only use it for liberals. And look, come on, liberals. So there's so many, of course. It sucks when every dog can has its day and can identify something correctly at some point, but the right wing uses it so narrowly, and of course for their own reactionary political ends. But the term
Exactly, yeah.
snowflake is very useful, in my opinion, because it really does encompass kind of the whole US ruling establishment at this time. And Joe Biden couldn't be any more representative of kind of like a pearl clutching, kind of extremely impaired politician who was literally just selected to be there to be the most loyal servant of the U.S. Political and economic establishment elite. Like, that's all he's there for. And it's likely temporary because they're already talking about, well, can this guy really do this anymore? There's already a lot of talk about that, and we're not even halfway through. But of his first term, and there's already talk about that. There are already concerns about that. I mean, come on, let's remember 2020 a little bit. We know that Joe Biden was high on their list, high on the establishment's list, but there was a reason why there was like 1,500 candidates. Right? It wasn't because it wasn't because Joe Biden was like, oh, look at this trophy we got here. They didn't even give him the Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was one of the most incompetent for other reasons, politicians, because of her arrogance and hubris and all of this. But she was given the, like, this is you have the trophy now. So all you got to do is go past the finish line, right? They just gave it to her and said, all you got to do is run past the finish line. She couldn't do it, of course. But, Biden didn't even get that treatment. And I think, just how he reacts to any criticism. I mean, there's so many moments. That moment that you mentioned is so true. And then, of course, whenever he's questioned on something like the murder of journalists in Israel or anything else, his level of defensiveness both feels partly because we were talking earlier, I worked with seniors in the past. I've seen a lot of seniors have this issue because you start to lose certain organizational process, the ability to react to stimuli in a certain way. That does go with age, and it also goes with cognitive issues. But I'm not a doctor, so I can't diagnose him. Yeah. But we know he has some problems in that area. And we also know that he also is occupying one of the most insecure periods of the US's kind of political system. This is the most insecure it can get, right? A pandemic, economic crisis, possible World War III. I mean, you're talking about just one thing after another, and you're asking Joe Biden to handle it. You're asking Joe Biden to handle this while he's having a hard time figuring out if he should give a fist bump or a handshake out there. I mean, you saw this was a controversy. This was trending on Twitter for a little while about, he wasn't supposed to give a fist bump or anything to the Israeli representatives who were meeting him because of COVID-19 or whatever. And then he just doesn't listen. He's forcing his fist bump. They're like, no, please don't do it. And he's just like, come on, guys, come on. And then he goes to fucking Saudi Arabia, and he's not supposed to give a fist bump to Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince, because, well, he's supposed to be there in part to be like to be a bully, kind of, on many fronts. He's supposed to go there and say, hey, you need to pump more oil, and you need to also, I need to like do some public relations things here and say, you need to stop being so atrocious, human rights, blah, blah, blah. And while he did some of that, he still couldn't help give a very friendly fist bump to Mohammed bin Salman, which then blew up in his face because that wasn't the plan. The plan was he was supposed to be very kind of on guard and ready to stand up to Saudi Arabia on many different things. But he ended up coming in with a smile like, hey, guy, come here. Like, give me a fist bump. We got love for each other, and kind of ended up unraveling the whole plan. So this is Joe Biden, but we know this is incredibly dangerous because we know that Biden and the Democrats, they just signed that big military budget, $840 billion. They voted unanimously for it on the Democratic Party aisle. And we know a large portion of that's going to go to Israel, and we know a large portion of that's going to Saudi Arabia. And both of those regimes are, they're terrorist regimes, and they're incredibly oppressive, and they serve U.S. foreign policy goals.
Yeah, and they perpetuate violence against, already struggling innocent people, men, women, and children in devastating, just absolutely devastating ways. And, it's like a good old boys club, for Israel and Saudi Arabia with the U.S. And that's one of, like, by far, I think the most prominent things that I'm always seeing, as a woman. I'm just like, there's so few women as part of these conversations, as part of these talks. And so it really just kind of solidifies, that the United States is the patriarchy that's wanting to just kind of maintain its colonialist rule, and that is Biden. And unfortunately, when it comes to like the cognitive aspect of Biden, I I even told my husband, I was like, it's like Weekend at Biden's, this whole trip. Because it's just, he's having to be ushered and moved around. He at one point was like shaking the air because like he was gonna shake hands with someone, and the guy had to like come around the podium and like point to get Biden to point to like make it seem like it wasn't as big of a gaffe as it was. It's also just kind of scary that we have someone who is so inept and so unable to follow through with policies for the American people that will benefit us here at home, because it truly is just a scare trip. This was like, oh, we're really scared about everything that's going on with Russia and China actually having a semblance of camaraderie and like kind of working together. They're seeing their power basically just dwindle, and that to me was just like the biggest showing of this entire trip. And that's why he's going to go and kiss the ring for the Saudi Arabian elite and try to get more oil, because it's his fault. Like, you put sanctions down and are affecting basically the entire Western world with these tactics that everyone said were not going to work, that we said this is going to affect the people and not the people at the top. So it's just a really unfortunate situation. And I feel for us Americans here, because we don't have a democracy. We have something, but it doesn't feel like a democracy. And I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I do have a lot of hope just for the activists on the ground, people that are really trying to, bring all of this information to light. And there's so much information out there and so much that's happening. And at times it feels very purposeful. So it's like we've all got to just like keep doing the good work, fight the good fight, and just hope that things can change.
Right. No, yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I'm glad you brought up Russia and China. Are you pressed for time? Do you need to go
I am
soon?
free, so I can stay.
Okay, so maybe if you could stick around for this one
Yeah, sure.
last point about this trip that Biden made to Israel and Saudi Arabia, I think is important, because the Times actually published today, and maybe we can go through it, a piece that talked about how underneath all of the kind of they're kind of like these niche issues when it comes to Saudi Arabia and when it comes to Israel, right? It's like you have, of course, the Palestinian question, which generally actually gets minimized quite a lot in these visits. We didn't see really any progress there. And then, of course, with Saudi Arabia, it used to be just oil. Like we got to get oil and we got to get military partnerships. But now, because of the Khashoggi incident, the murder of the Washington Post journalist during the Trump period, and then of course the war on Yemen, which is not popular, especially among Democratic Party voters. It's not popular now. A lot of Democratic Party voters are saying, we don't really like these arms sales. They don't really do much for us. And Saudi Arabia is it really is a sight for sore eyes at this point, right? Like there's just no hiding the humanitarian crisis that has been imposed upon Yemen. I know you've done a lot of work there, and certainly feel free to talk about that. But I want to pull up this article that the New York Times published. I think it was today about this. And while you're all waiting, everyone, don't forget to continue to like and share this stream. So like the stream, it helps boost the algorithm. Continue to like it. And of course, the way you can support this is at patreon.com/Dhaiphong. And I want to, this is a really interesting title, guys. So here is what this was published. Was it today? Yes, it was. By David Sanger. That he's a piece of work. He was an Iraq war propagandist. But nonetheless, this is a very interesting piece. Just the way that it's talked about. This is like through the lens of the national security state. as Biden reaches out to Mideast dictators. So this is his eyes are on China and Russia, looking to make Moscow pay for its Ukraine war and box China out of Mideast tech deals. The U.S. president tries to fall back on old Gulf alliances. So here, the New York Times is literally stating that a huge reason why Biden is there is because he wants to, as you were saying, Amir, he's responding to Russia and China's growing influence in the world. And so, you know, the way that they talk about this is hilarious because it's, as we were both talking, like this is not the same. This is like if this were 5-10 years ago, the way that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries that the U.S. has militarized and supported for so many decades, the narrative would be different. But now you have all these words used, like painful encounters with the series of Arab strongmen here in Saudi Arabia this weekend. President Biden kept returning to a single reason for renewing his relationship with American allies who fall in the wrong stride of the struggle he often describes as a battle between quote unquote democracy and autocracy. We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran, Mr. Biden said at a session on Saturday with 9 Arab leaders in a cavernous hotel ballroom in this ancient port on the Red Sea. I mean, it's so wild how even trying to create an image of how atrocious these regimes are tends to just end up being racist. I mean, this is just theatrical racism toward countries that the United States literally props up. Anyway, and we'll seek to build on this moment with active, principled leadership. So he's framing America's mission as part of a renewed form of superpower competition, and it's revealing for decades. This is great. American presidents largely saw the Middle East as a hotbed of strife and instability, a place the United States needed a presence, largely to keep oil flowing and eliminate terrorist havens. Now, more than 20 years after a group of Saudis left this country to stage terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and strike the Pentagon, Mr. Biden is driven by a new concern that his forced dance with dictators, while distasteful, is the only choice if his larger goal is to contain and outmaneuver China. Forced dance with dictators. This is just unhinged propaganda, first of all. But anyway, I want to get your reaction, Amir, quickly to that, because for me, what's hilarious, and we can continue with the article as well and try to find interesting bits. But to me, this is just propaganda, like literally saying that the U.S. needed a presence here and then in the region, and then to say that this is a forced stance. Of course, importantly, it is important that they're mentioning Russia and China and that Biden can't get his mind off of Russia and China, because it does show this new strategy, and that everything the United States does is to isolate those two countries and to build up to a really dangerous war. But even so, the way that the New York Times is framing this as a mouthpiece of the Pentagon and the national security state, and then the way that Biden is talking about it, there is just so much propaganda here that can be just completely debunked really easily. And it's all to make the United States look like this victim. It's like it's got to go through this like arduous mission to defend democracy by, propping up all these really militarized human rights disasters in this region, and destroying that region as well, like completely just obliterating it and killing millions of people. And then we'll get to that democracy and we'll confront Russia and China. But anyway, I want to get your reaction.
So, one of the most ridiculous things about this is, acting like the U.S. isn't the reason why the situation is the way that it is in the Middle East. And I was immediately going to the pharmaceutical company. It's like they create a problem so that they can give you medicine for a problem that they've created that gives you more side effects that they have to then give you more medicine. That's basically how I look at the United States military-industrial complex. It's they want to go into these regions, cause instability so that they can say there's instability in the region. We need to go in and be the peacemakers and figure out how to fix this issue, when all in all, it's some, op that's been done to dismantle a ruler, a tyrant, whatever. But it's this constant like hubris by the United States of acting like they can solve a problem, but they're actually the ones that created the problem in the first place. I mean, and that's why the Middle East is in the tumultuous situation that it is, because of colonialist intervention that happened in the early 1900s, like even before, Israel and needing a Jewish state to protect the Jews from the Holocaust even was a thing, because this was as the Ottoman Empire was declining, and they took advantage of that declining moment to dismantle this entire region and have all this infighting going on in areas that didn't necessarily see that before. And now they use the religious tensions, the differences between the different sects, to say, oh, this is why this is happening. This is why there's terrorism. This is why there's Al Qaeda. This is why they bombed the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and things like that. I could say so much about those things, but
Yeah.
it's just like the US creates these problems and then acts like they're the savior, and they still don't even fix the issue. They just make more issues.
Yep. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just so obvious that the United States is the problem in the region. I mean, the United States, since 1979, when it created the Mujahideen or facilitated their growth, and then destroyed Afghanistan, to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam, and then on and on and on, right? Multiple times trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein and overthrow Iraq's government, and then finally doing so in 2003 in the most brutal of manners. And then, of course, we saw what happened in Libya and Syria, and on and on and on, just like a one catastrophe after another, proliferating terrorism, creating this huge refugee crisis. And now the region is more unstable, less united, more impoverished than it's ever been in maybe in its history. I mean, we're talking about the cradle of civilization. Like, this is not a region without a rich history, even in the 20th century, of building a united front to develop along modern lines. Like, this isn't it's often framed in a really racist way, in the opposite. But this region has a rich history. And I wanted to go back to the article because it's a pretty rich one. It gets better, I feel like. So here they admit, this is something that's admitted now in Western mainstream corporate press, in the US corporate press, Mr. Biden's effort here to negotiate greater oil production, jarring enough for a president who came to office vowing to help wean the world from fossil fuels, I mean, a lot of this feels like a jab at Biden too. There's obviously a crisis of confidence in the Biden administration that you would not have seen 12 months ago. 6 to 12 months ago, it would have been the Biden apology tour. Now the ship is really rocky. There's a lot of holes on it. It's sinking. And the corporate media, while not really criticizing and condemning in a real productive way, is really taking a lot of jabs at Biden. I find that very interesting. But this is also more interesting. So it's all driven, they say, by the need to make Russia pay a steep price for invading Ukraine. And here's what they admit. So far, that price has been scanned. Not only are the Russians continuing to collect substantial oil and gas revenues, they are even supplying Saudi Arabia, Reuters reported recently, with fuel for its power plants at discounted prices. So they're admitting that that the United States is not succeeding in Ukraine at all. Like, they're not succeeding, and they're not even succeeding in pulling key so-called allies like Saudi Arabia into their orbit to make their plans in Ukraine more successful. I mean, it's just, it just couldn't be any more blatant. Anyway, do you have any reactions to that?
I mean, well, just like the common adage of like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's basically what we've done with this, with Russia, China, and even Saudi Arabia. Because just like we were talking about, with Israel, that they're not as good of an ally as people think that they are. Saudi Arabia too, they will do the same thing. The minute a better deal comes on the table, they're going to take it. And you kind of can't blame them for doing that. Every country is trying to maintain their dominance and their larger place on the global scale of power and control and prosperity. And so, I mean, that's essentially what's happening here.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about Saudi Arabia, because as this article will continue to talk about with Russia and China, Saudi Arabia has, I mean, there are reports in Reuters as well that the Saudi regime is saying, look, we are not going to cut ties with Russia and China. We are going to balance between the United States, Russia, and China. We're not going to discriminate. And I think what's so interesting about that is it's really a stark message to the United States that even its most historically, you could say, close relationships in this region, even Israel's like this too, are looking at what is happening to the United States. Even with Israel being so connected with the petrodollar and all that, they're looking at the United States and they're saying, that's not a great bet. Like that's not a good, like we can't hedge all of our bets on the United States because of its instability and its unreliability. Like, I mean, this is the United States coming to Saudi Arabia and basically saying, do what we say. That eventually will wear upon even the most closest of friends, when you are also not necessarily the most stable and legitimate and powerful looking force that maybe you once were. And they talk about here in the New York Times that there was an announcement that they're going to try to cooperate to build. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. There's barely any 5G technology in the United States, but the United States is trying to compete with China and Huawei, which is the main builder in China of 5G technology, and now 6G coming up. The United States announced an agreement where they're going to try to help Saudi Arabia do that. I find that hilarious because they did that in the G7 too. They said, we're going to spend $600 billion and build infrastructure. And none of these countries, the United States especially, none of these Western countries have built a damn thing since Biden has been in office alone with the whole Build Back Better and the Build Back Better world, nothing. But yet now, no matter what we're talking about, what event we're talking about, the United States, Biden has to do something to kind of pander to this. And so, the New York Times is saying this is all an effort to begin pushing back on Beijing and parts of the world where for years the Chinese government has made progress without feeling much competition. Talk about the NATO summit meeting. Biden celebrated a new strategic concept that for the first time recognized China as a systemic challenge, describing its policies as coercive and its cyber operations around the world as malicious. That wasn't in quotes in this article. So you get the message. The doctrine said that along with Russia, Beijing was trying to subvert the rules-based international order, words similar to those the Biden administration has used on this trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia. Of course, it's similar, of course. But after that summit, European officials said they would focus on pushing back on China's influence. Okay, so this is all just repeating. So the effort here in Jeddah is similar, to show that the United States will help push back on Chinese and Russian influence. Mr. Biden outlined a 5-part new framework for the Middle East that included supporting economic development, military security, and democratic freedoms. Let me conclude by summing up in one sentence. The United States is invested in building a positive future in the region in partnership with all of you. And the United States is not going anywhere. I love how everything is like, it's a partnership, but we ain't going nowhere. It doesn't matter if you agree or not. We're not going anywhere. It's like everything is a threat. Everything it's a threat. Even the countries that are like not even saying, hey, we don't want to be around you. Like these countries are literally like we're trying our best to, serve you and to be around, to get to have a relationship. But in a room full of unelected autocrats and absolute monarchs, he made a point of nudging them on human rights a day after his meeting with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who, according to the CIA, ordered the 2018 operation that killed Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. Freedom of dissent, he said, would make them stronger, not weaker. So some lecturing there. He made no mention of the fact that looms over the Middle East countries' commercial dealings with Beijing. They know that China's investments come without lectures, much less sanctions for human rights violations. But Mr. Biden tried to make the case that freedom and innovation go hand in hand. So, anyway, I mean that's kind of amazing, honestly, for them to admit again that the United States knows, and the New York Times obviously knows, that China's investments come without lectures, they said, and much less sanctions for human rights violations. And so, what's your reaction to this? Because for me, to me, this is just like the empire is naked, and it's telling a very, I don't know, there's something almost like this feels like a children's story. I don't know. It feels like they're writing it like, so like I feel like I can't help but read it in the way I am, because there's all these descriptors, and like they're trying really hard to make this sound almost childlike. Like there's some kind of like they're like playing at the park or something, and they're like kicking the ball around, and they're trying to figure out what are the rules of the game. That's what it feels like here.
I agree. It's very infantile in a way, and it's also just very sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought for a moment. It's very, very telling about, they want to tell a particular story. So like they want to tell the story that they're telling themselves in their head and have that be disseminated on the New York Times with this is very like fragrant language in a way, trying to make certain things look good, and then the like tiny bits of scolding what the Biden administration is doing. But nothing that Biden is saying is anything of substance. Like, and that seems to kind of be the unfortunate Democratic Party method right now, is it's just a lot of talk that just is circular. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't provide anything of substance, and it doesn't do anything. Like, because this isn't going to change anything. This isn't going to do anything of substance to either the region or to the United States. It's not going to bolster ties between these nations. If anything, I think Russia and China and even like Saudi Arabia and these monarchs are seeing how, like kind of like you said, like this like nakedness. It's like the emperor is not wearing any clothes right now. And it's just so very evident with Biden. I don't think that they know how to have him do this in like a functional capacity. So they just kind of give him these kind of blanket statements to make that don't mean anything, but it's the story in their head that they want us to believe, even though all of the evidence points to the contrary.
Oh yeah, definitely. And we're going to finish this article, I think, to conclude our segment together. But I definitely want to just reiterate, that I think part of this circular logic too, and I usually stay away from this argument because I don't think it's a great one, but I do think that there is an element of part of the reason why the New York Times is talking about it like this, talking about this issue like this, and it almost sounds like they're communicating with what they, and this could afflict them as well. I'm not, this is definitely, I think, a problem for the messenger as much as it is for those receiving it, is there is a circular logic that's dumbed down. Like this feels very dumbed down. It feels like this is kind of like, here's what the national security say in the Pentagon wants, what they're saying, here's their message, and we're kind of giving it to you in like a children's book form because we don't really give a crap about what you think. You are not critical of this. This is not for you to be critical of. This is you to digest so you can take it to your think tanks, take it to your whatever. the other guy, Baker, I forget his first name, he's a Washington Post guy. Sanger's a New York Times. I mean, these guys, they're all part of the same club. And then they're talking to those who participate in the club, who are in the membership in the club. There is no, this isn't to cater to anyone who's for peace, isn't to cater to the left. It's all just kind of like recycling establishment talking points so that they're informed about, here's the strategy, here's whether it's successful, here's, we know that, Deborah Messing, you guys are kind of like mad at Biden. You don't think he's the most competent. Okay, so let's just do a little dance, here in the New York Times and give you what feels like the most sanitized yet also very revealing way of communicating what really is just straight up diktats from and talking points from the foreign policy establishment.
Very much, and it's signaling to the mainstream media like, CNN and MSNBC, this is what you can talk about. This is the critiques that you can have of the Biden administration, and then this is what you need to say to elevate Biden a little bit more and fluff him up and make him feel better.
Indeed. All right, well, let's try to finish this. It's one of these articles that's a little too long, but let's see if there's any other nuggets in here, and let's try to get through it. So it says, Biden also sought to reassure Sunni Arab leaders around the table that his efforts to negotiate a renewed nuclear agreement with their, this is just what you said about playing up these divisions, with their Shiite nemesis in Iran would not put them in jeopardy. As we continue to work closely with many of you to counter the threats posed to the region by Iran, we're pursuing diplomacy to return constraints on Iran's nuclear program, Mr. Biden said. But no matter what, the United States is committed to ensuring that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. So basically, he's saying we're kind of sort of in a Iran nuclear deal, hopefully, trying to get some kind of thing again with Iran, some kind of JPCOA thing, but not really. That's like really like not really. We say we're doing it, you guys, but we think Iran's. I'm still on the Trump kind of bandwagon with that. So he continues the session with the 6-member Gulf GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, along with the leaders of 3 other Arab states, came after Mr. Biden met separately with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt, where tens of thousands of political prisoners are locked up. And see, here's another kind of like, oh, look at Joe Biden supporting these dictators. Mr. Sisi has been waging a relentless crackdown on dissent. Biden made no comment when reporters were in the room for the first few minutes, but instead thanked Mr. Sisi for the incredible assistance he made to Gaza, where Egypt has promised to help rebuild following last year's brief war between Hamas and Israel. Aide said he would raise human rights in private. In the contest with China, the that's it's bad. Egypt's so bad for giving aid to Israel because they crack down on dissent. It's like a complete anyway. In the contest with China, United States still has close ties throughout the Middle East, with business interests that flowed in for decades after the discovery of oil. Yet pushing back on China's influence in the region will be an uphill struggle, as many of the president's advisors acknowledge. China has made sweeping progress in recent years. While America was fighting wars in the region, China's Belt and Road Development Initiative was advancing across the Gulf, even building a major port in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, until work stopped following warnings to the UAE that Beijing's real purpose was to create a stealth military base. Wow. In January, Chinese officials held a virtual meeting with Saudi officials about selling military gear to the kingdom, a recognition that Chinese arms are now significantly higher tech than they were even just a few years ago. Decades ago, Saudi Arabia bought some giant intercontinental ballistic missiles from China, triggering fears it might be exploring building nuclear weapons. But that concern has not come to fruition. I love how they can talk about concerns as coming to fruition. But anyway, Huawei has been wiring up the region, quietly installing its networks on the theory that the country that controls the flow of electrons across national networks will hold extraordinary control over the region's infrastructure. During the Trump administration, the United States warned allies if they signed up with Huawei and other Chinese suppliers, Washington would cut off their access to intelligence reports and limit their participation in military alliances. Boo fucking who? I don't understand. But it was not all carrot and stick, since there was no alternative American product to offer them. This is a really interesting article. What Mr. Biden was holding out this weekend is a new technology called OpenRAN, or for Open Radio Access Networks, which run largely on software and access information in the cloud, all areas where the United States holds advantages. Over months of negotiation, American officials worked out a memorandum of understanding in which Saudi Arabia will essentially turn itself into a test bed for using the system on a large scale, even though Huawei has already deployed its networks throughout the country. So basically, the United States is selling wolf tickets here. That is the thinking of the project, said Ann Newenberg, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. Quickly building up a prototype here in Saudi Arabia will prove that it works at scale and become a model for the region. She called it a pragmatic, reality-based project. Asked about the American strategy, Saudi officials went to some lengths to say they're not trying to edge China out of anything and that they could accommodate both Western and Chinese telecom systems. The Saudi ambassador to the United States, Princess Rima bint Bandar Al Saud, compared having coexisting technologies to having a Starbucks and a Coffee Bean or a McDonald's and a Burger King. But that doesn't make them happy. But networks are far more complex because they need to operate with each other. Skeptics wonder whether the Cold War framing of the need to rekindle alliances in the Middle East is more of an excuse for oil deals than a real interest in deep engagement. It's true China is making some inroads, says Corey Shake, the director of Foreign and Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. But those are the natural result of China's energy needs and oil producers experiencing a bonanza because of Russia's invasion and the U.S. under the last 3 presidents declining to retaliate for Iranian attacks on Gulf states. But it's also the result of the Biden administration policy setting up the China challenge as democracy versus autocracy, which puts Saudi on the Chinese side of the ledger. I mean, that's a really big, and that's the conclusion, basically saying Saudi Arabia is not in the U.S.'s camp at all. I mean, that's like basically ending. I mean, American Enterprise Institute is a libertarian think tank, like a major, like funded by major fucking corporate interests. They do not like China. They rail against China all the time. And yet they're talking about how Saudi Arabia is not really buying what the U.S. is selling, despite making all these deals. But anyway, I wanted to conclude the argument. There's so many little nuggets in there. Do you have any reactions to anything, Amira?
I mean, some of it goes into some areas that I don't feel as like well researched to be able to like, give my full opinion. But I do think that, China, I think, has been really silently trying to build up both their infrastructure and their economy, and also just ties in the region with different nations, because everyone does see how the US is starting to decline. And I think it's about like who's going to be in the more powerful position. And I do think that China is in a better position than like Russia would be, because there's also just so much ties from China to the US when it comes to economics. But I mean, especially like when it comes to like the 5G networks and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of things on the side that's looking at like the science of all of this, and that it's not necessarily like a healthy thing for us to be having, because of what it does to just like the energy in the atmosphere or whatever. Like I said, not fully, I don't feel as informed on this as I should be, but I think that we really need to look at everything that's happening in the region, and how all of these issues with oil production and sanctions, and it's making these nations want to start working together. It's basically going against US interests. Everything that we did for this Russia-Ukraine war, this proxy war, has been to basically bolster these outside nations, and it's greatly affecting us and our ability to deal with our very real situations here happening in the United States. And unfortunately, like the Biden administration, they're so focused on the international part, and they're losing sight of the domestic part that we really do need to be looking at. And it just feels like there's no one there doing that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's incredible to see the New York Times literally through. I mean, we're talking about, they put their bios at the end of this article. I've talked about Sanger because he was promoting the weapons of mass destruction narrative as well. But he's a national security correspondent. He's been doing that for 38 years. I mean, this guy is, for lack of a better term, he is a deep state journalist. And then
Yes.
Peter Baker is the White House correspondent and has covered the last 5 presidents for the Times and the Post. So these guys are very connected. They are basically talking shop, and
Mhm.
they admitted in that last section of the article, basically, the United States doesn't have really anything to offer. Even this plan for so-called 5G connectivity, all of
Mm-hmm.
that through the cloud, it's really a mask for the real interest, which is to just try to pull Saudi Arabia away from China and from Russia. That it actually there's no products that the United States can really offer to Saudi Arabia, and China has already done so much through its telecommunication systems and weapons. And one thing about the weapons that's so interesting is people often take issue with this, and I think it has to be said that China's ability to produce extremely high-tech weaponry, while we may not like it because Saudi Arabia has, of course, an atrocious record inside of Saudi Arabia and, of course, Yemen, right? We may not
Mm-hmm.
like that. But on the other hand, what ends up happening when China becomes more and more of an economic force, right, in the region, and as well as even a military force through this kind of aid, because it doesn't do bases, it doesn't do that. Even the New York Times would say, oh, well, the military base stuff, not really a thing. Nuclear weapons, not really a thing. Now, this is really just economics through weapons. And
Mm-hmm.
what it has done is it has created more of an incentive for countries like Saudi Arabia to do what it's doing now, which is, do we just continue to go along with the US's way of doing things, or do we, or do we move in a different direction? And that does have some utility. It's not the prettiest in the world, and we certainly, this isn't like something that we are, celebrating. But we know that the more integrated countries become with China and Russia, generally the better things become. The more that there is a capacity for us to see, like, I don't see any capacity for the war in Yemen to end unless the US's role in this region is shrunk. And the only way that role is going to shrink is China and Russia's engagement in the region intensifies, because those are countries that actually have interests in stopping such a thing, because there is no China can't Belt and Road, and Russia can't integrate in the region with Saudi Arabia, invading Yemen and destroying that country. Yemen happens to be there's a reason why Saudi Arabia is invading Yemen. It happens to be a very strategic and very strategically located country, and
Mm-hmm.
one that if you can get influence and control over, you can actually reap a lot of benefits from it. So China and Russia generally don't want to see it. So there are, I think, things that need to play out. So a lot of people ask me, well, how about weapons transfers to Saudi Arabia? I'm like, well, it's more complicated than just, yeah, we're giving you weapons so you can wage war on Yemen, right? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of this is just economic dealings, and China and Russia are like, we can't get involved, but we know that if we can build stronger relationships, you ask us what you want, we ask what we want. If we can do that, then maybe things can get more stable, and maybe things like, listening to international law will become more possible, even though, the internal situation, of course, in Saudi Arabia is absolutely horrific. So it's
Yeah.
complicated, but I think that there are so many considerations that I think sometimes we look at politics, especially foreign policy, we can look at it so simplistically, because what grabs our attention, rightfully so, is the horrific crimes that the US and its partners are committing. And that's totally something we should continue to keep our eyes on. But now we're seeing such a shift that even the New York Times has to admit that the United States is kind of losing its grip here. And to say that the United States is losing its grip with Saudi Arabia, I think is a pretty watershed moment in in terms of the history of the United States' empire. But I want to give you the last word, Amira. I'm going to stay on probably for another 45 minutes to an hour, everyone. So stick around. But Amira, I want to give you the last word.
I just want to say thank you very much for having me on, Danny. I really do appreciate it. So if you like what I've been talking about today, you can find my work at Endemic Times. I have a YouTube channel as well as a blog, and I talk about a lot of different issues there. I do political analysis, cultural issues, and then a lot of focus on mainstream media topics that kind of go under the radar, and really trying to bring a light and a voice to the people that are really struggling both here in the United States and around the world. I have recently put out a video on Yemen, so in kind of what we've been talking about here, about the countless children that are starving because of malnutrition and the lack of food, and the upcoming food shortages that are basically already there in the region, and how that's affecting them and their ability to survive. So thank you again, Danny, for
Yeah.
allowing me to come on today. And thank you, everyone, for your very nice comments. I really do appreciate them. And I hope
Yeah.
everyone has a great night.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Amira. I put your YouTube channel back in the chat. It's also in the description of this video. So definitely subscribe, follow the work there. Thanks so much again, Amira. We'll have to talk again soon.
Definitely. Thank you.
Bye. All right, everyone. That was a great conversation. Thanks so much for listening and viewing. I'm going to stick around, though, for maybe another 45 minutes to an hour. All right. 45 minutes to an hour. So I have a few things I want to cover. I mean, a couple. I mean, this is like kind of the empire's the empire's clothes are being stripped off. All right. So the empire has no clothes. That's going to be the topic of my next bar column. All right. The next bar column is the empire's clothes. It has no clothes. That's what's going to happen. All right. I just finished the draft today, and it'll include a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. But keep liking the stream, everyone. Keep liking it. Keep sharing it. Hitting that subscribe button. I'm close to another goal that will actually help me out to keep my actual annual goal. So I'm about 19 subscribers on Patreon away from my goal of 500. So the reason I have that goal is not because I haven't reached my annual goal in terms of the amount of money, but because that helps keep it so I stay above that. All right. So that I keep, this is how the gig economy works. So 500 subscribers, 19 away. Please do subscribe. Patreon.com/Dhaiphong. It helps sustain this work. All right. So let's talk about a few things. All right. First, I want to talk about John Bolton's comments, and then I want to do I want to show you a video that NATO put out. As kind of like, this is like the empire really has no clothes. We're kind of moving in that trend throughout this live stream tonight. With Amira, we talked about Biden and Israel, and the New York Times' kind of puff piece that revealed a whole lot, right, about the U.S. empire's overall strategy and its condition. It's not in a good condition. The U.S. empire is not in a good condition, and the New York Times is admitting as such. So that's one part of this. But then the other part is how people like Joe Biden will say, oh, yeah, we love Israel. We love it. It's a democracy. We're going to pump it with military aid. We're going to prop it up. And they're telling us to our faces. So that is one part of the empire has no clothes. And then you have guys like John Bolton. I mean, John Bolton has called for the bombing of Iran. I mean, in the corporate media, he has over and over again, he has no filter. So over and over again, he's kind of numero uno, number one in terms of what it means to express the fact that the empire has no clothes. The empire is naked. But John Bolton was on CNN not too long ago. This was The Guardian reporting July 13th. So he's on CNN, and I want you to watch this. Now, I'm hoping that copyright doesn't get me, because I'm not going to go to the actual tweet. I'm just going to read it. I'm just going to have you view it from The Guardian. Okay. And I want you to see what John Bolton says. I want you to hear it. he's talking about January 6th. He's being grilled about it. I want you to hear what he says about his role as, someone who's worked for multiple administrations, former national security advisor of Donald Trump. So here's what he had to say.
Not heed the advice and keep shopping around until you end up with this group of misfits with like Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell. Is he just not capable of hearing no?
Well, when it comes to his personal advantage, the answer is he doesn't listen to anybody else. But I think it's also important to understand, while nothing Donald Trump did after the election in connection with the lie about the election fraud, none of it is defensible. None of it is defensible. It's also a mistake, as some people have said, including on the committee, the commentators, that somehow this was a carefully planned coup d'etat aimed at the Constitution. That's not the way Donald Trump does things. It's rambling from one half-vast idea to another, one plan that falls through and another comes up. That's what he was doing. As I say, none of it defensible. But you have to understand the nature of what the problem of Donald Trump is. He's, to use a Star Wars metaphor, a disturbance in the force. And it's not an attack on our democracy. It's Donald Trump looking out for Donald Trump. It's a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence.
I don't know that I agree with you. To be fair, with all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
Hard work. It's hard work waging those coups, guys. It's really hard work. It's hard work figuring out how to destroy another country, kill its people, and all that good stuff. Hard work.
He was just stumbling around from one idea to another. Ultimately, he did unleash the rioters at the Capitol. As to that, there's no doubt. But not to overthrow the Constitution, to buy more time to throw the matter back to the states to try and redo the issue. And if you don't believe that, you're going to overreact. And I think that's a real risk for the committee, which has done a lot of good work, mostly when the witnesses testify, not when the members are opining.
All right. Well, that's enough of that. But that's John Bolton. I mean, John Bolton, right, is just completely obsessed with Venezuela. He wrote in his memoirs how important that coup was. He laughed. I believe he laughed when the video came out of Venezuelan security forces and people running away during an attempted assassination of President Maduro with a drone. If you all remember that, he said he laughed at that footage. I mean, this is someone who's completely unhinged. He's called for bombing Iran. He's called for confrontation with the big powers, Russia, China. He is, of course, a neocon hawk, and he's never seen a war that he doesn't like. But for him to go on CNN, right, and his contention, right, he's anti-Trump. He's gone on the anti-Trump bandwagon. He gained a lot of political favors from Trump. And then, of course, when times got rough, he saw the opportunity to make a lot of money off of the anti-Trump wave. And that's what he's done. So now he's anti-Trump. He's criticizing Donald Trump for January 6th. But he's also saying that what Donald Trump did while January 6th was bad, it wasn't a coup, because he knows, because he has attempted to orchestrate coups throughout his political career. And of course, he said it's hard work. It's hard work doing this. It's not like Donald Trump's half-assed attempts to shore up his own personal status. That is not like that. Coups are hard work. They're challenging. I mean, this is the government that we live under. This is the regime that we live under. This is what imperialism is. Imperialism isn't when U.S. imperialism gives us this American exceptionalism, innocence, and all of this kind of mythology about how amazing it is, how incredible it is, how advanced it is, how democratic it is, how freedom-loving it is, how diplomatic it is, how angelic it is, how much liberty there is, right? When it talks about all of these things, when it says all of that, I mean, just think that it is concealing what is even more heinous than anything you could think of. Regimes like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the most corrupt partners of the United States, anything that you could think of them saying, you should think the U.S. establishment, foreign policy establishment, is saying, thinking, and doing a lot worse. And that is not hyperbole, because we know during this war on Yemen, the United States has not only supplied weapons, but has also supplied advisors, intelligence officers, all sorts of logistical support for torture programs that the UAE has run. We know this is documented fact on the war on Yemen. The United States has absolutely no moral high ground. None. It has none. The empire has no clothes. The empire is the root of all of these problems. It's the root of Zionism and its ability to control the land, territory, and the politics and the movement and everything from the Palestinian people and the region at large, occupy the Syrian Golan Heights, all of that, right? It's at the root of that. It's at the root of Saudi Arabia's crimes, all of them. It's at the root of all that's should be the point here. Is not that, oh, well, John Bolton is just revealing that he planned coups, and of course he did. But I think even more so what's important about this is that when the empire is showing you it has no clothes, you should think that it's thinking, saying, and doing a lot worse than what even John Bolton was saying. It is doing a lot worse, right? Because what John Bolton and CNN, Jake Tapper didn't even challenge. Not even, he said, oh, I planned coups. Jake Tapper wasn't like, oh, well, what do you mean by that, right? This is how the media operates. They don't care about the fact that John Bolton may have said, oh, he planned coups, but that there are consequences to the policies. John Bolton, Donald Trump, and of course, Joe Biden after him, they supported just absolutely draconian sanctions that have killed 10,000 plus people in Venezuela in just a few years. So think about that. More people have died, premature deaths in Venezuela. Thousands of people, more than 10,000 people have died in Venezuela due to U.S. sanctions that were imposed by Donald Trump, escalated by Donald Trump. And of course, there's only been a little bit of relief under Biden because of the Ukraine crisis, but it has not been enough. And it's been all of Venezuela's efforts and all of their capacity to assert their self-determination that has helped the situation and made things a bit better. But still, those deaths, you don't get them back. The people are dead, and the economic catastrophe happened, and they're still building themselves out of it. And it's because of John Bolton. And the military threat is still always there because the United States is always funding and fueling the right-wing oligarchic opposition in Venezuela and across Latin America. And that's what John Bolton did. And so John Bolton is very he is very enthusiastic about it, and he there is being diplomatic. So think about that. Him just saying I plan coups, that's him being Mr. Nice Guy. And that's what it shouldn't frighten us, although to the lay observer, to someone who maybe has never been exposed to this, it may frighten you. It may frighten you that your government is a sociopathic, mass murdering regime that only cares about the profits of a very few entities, corporations, and of course people, right? That might frighten you if you just found that out. But for those of us who have known that, what it should show is that and demonstrate is that actually what he's saying is not even a slice of the total pie of destruction and absolute criminality that the U.S. empire represents. So the empire has no clothes. And I want to show you one other thing, because this gets better. So you saw the New York Times and John Bolton, right? They kind of just peddle the NATO line. There's a lot of unity here. The national security state, the military-industrial complex, they are running a very tight ship in terms of which geopolitical objectives are profitable and which are the ones that need to be, that need to be followed. And so I want to show you this video clip that NATO put out on its Twitter page. And so this video clip, guys, this video clip is talking about how Russia continues to spread many false myths about NATO. And so this is just another instance where NATO feels like, right, that it has to, because it is naked. I mean, its aggression right now is naked, pumping billions of dollars worth in weaponry into a war that is killing many people. It's out in the open. NATO is, if it's not to blame, which it is, but even if you don't blame NATO, NATO can't help but try to uh, maneuver, kind of like how John Bolton just lacks those skills. There's just a constant attempt, right, to either reveal the truth about the empire right now or to try to skirt the truth that's already out there. So let's watch this video.
Russia continues to spread lots of false myths about NATO. So let us set the record straight. One myth is that NATO is aggressive towards Russia and is trying to encircle it. This is not true. NATO is a defensive alliance. Its purpose is to protect its allies. NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia. Every sovereign nation has the right to choose its own security arrangements. Russia has subscribed to this fundamental principle. We stay true to it and invite Russia to do the same. Another myth is that NATO...
So NATO is no threat to Russia. So, I mean, think about the whispers are hilarious. But then you have, all right, I gotta block this trope. And then you have them say, NATO is saying that it's no threat to Russia when William Burns, the former, now the CIA director under Biden, but former U.S. ambassador to Russia, has said that NATO's expansion would cause a potential conflict that the United States doesn't want. So obviously, even within the national security establishment, even within Washington, there's been awareness that NATO actually is a threat to Russia, or at least is perceived to be that. But NATO wants to pretend it's defensive. What's hilarious about this is that NATO has expanded along Russia's borders to provoke it, to create this conflict that is now going on in Ukraine. That NATO NATO's plan is to provoke Russia and to contain Russia. That's what it's all about. That's not defensive, because the whole purpose of NATO was to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. But it never really was defensive. It was always about, first of all, when you say you're defending yourself from the Soviet Union, which was a country that had absolutely no interest of militarily engaging with Western Europe, that its whole entire purpose was to build socialism, and whatever countries wanted to build socialism too, and whatever republics had cultural and national sort of relationships could be part of the Soviet Union. That was really what the Soviet Union was doing. But NATO was started by the United States, started by Western European countries, with the express objective of first overthrowing ending the Soviet Union, and then now it didn't dismantle when that goal was accomplished. Not all in part because of NATO, but in part because of NATO. Now that the goal was accomplished in 1991, they didn't disband; they expanded. They added so many countries all the way up. They added more than a dozen countries. Right? NATO has expanded. It's now 32 countries. Right? So NATO has expanded astronomically, not defensively. And then think about all the wars that NATO has participated in or waged directly since even 1991. Yugoslavia, that wasn't defensive. That was all about overthrowing a government. That was about destroying the leadership of Yugoslavia, breaking it up, balkanizing it, and then, of course, right, overthrowing Milosevic, destroying Serbia, which was the last stronghold of socialism in Yugoslavia, so that corrupt statelets that were really backed, Croatia and others backed by fascists, fascists were being supported in these regions by NATO. That's what Yugoslavia was all about. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and Iraq. NATO participated in all of those. NATO was helping lead the invasion of Afghanistan, and then Libya, and then and we can go on and on and on. None of these are defensive, right? And neither is, nor is Ukraine. These wars have killed millions of people, destroyed entire societies. And here we have NATO telling us that's all defensive, and Russia, is good, whatever. Russia should just go along with it.
NATO promised Russia it would not expand after the Cold War. No such agreement was ever concluded. NATO's door has been open to new members since it was founded in 1949, and this has never changed. This open door policy is also enshrined in Article 10 of NATO's founding treaty. Decisions about membership are taken by consensus among all allies. No treaty signed by the United States, Europe, and Russia includes provisions regarding NATO membership. The myths need to be dismantled. The record needs to be set straight.
I don't know about you guys, but NATO's convinced me. I mean, that was some of the most convincing propaganda I've seen. That voice, I mean, I've been told that I can speak monotone and all, but that voice has me enthusiastic about NATO now. I don't know about you all. I am very, very convinced that NATO is a defensive institution that Russia is just lying about, and that everything is all right. And we just need to dismantle the myths about NATO. NATO is a totally democratic institution that has absolutely no plans at all to do anything except defend Europe or something like that. I'm totally convinced. But in seriousness, I mean, the point about the agreement, I think, is complex, right? Because on the one hand, there was indeed, I mean, this is not just some kind of made up thing, which the NATO tries to portray here. There was indeed a handshake agreement between the Gorbachev led government and the Soviet Union and the United States, that if the Soviet Union would continue to dismantle socialism, if it would continue to conduct what was a heinous crime for us socialists, heinous crime, which is continue to dismantle socialism and then eventually lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And part of that had to do with the what was going on in Germany. That if the Soviet Union backed off and supported that, right, supported the fall of socialism around its periphery, Eastern Europe, Germany, then NATO wouldn't expand. That did exist. It was a handshake agreement, though. So while totally unconvincing what NATO is saying, it is true that a handshake agreement, just like even a written agreement, look what's happening with China and Taiwan. They have joint communiques. China has joint communiques with the United States, multiple, talking about more than there's more than 3 of those. I know 3 of them, but there's at least 3 of those about Taiwan. And the United States doesn't follow any of them. I mean, the United States consistently violates them. So there's really nothing you can do to stop that, right? So, of course, it's a little, but I think the point stands that there was a conversation, it did happen, and NATO still violated it. So we can't delegitimize that, no matter how much NATO is trying here. They're just apologizing for their crimes, right? Because these are crimes. And then they point to their own article, like, who cares about what NATO writes? Whatever NATO writes is just about reinforcing and reproducing its interests. We don't care about what's so funny is that NATO thinks that it's like document, it's screed. It's like, oh, look at our constitution. That has no basis under international law. NATO is not a governing body within the framework of international law. It is not a UN organization. It is not some kind of representative of the Security Council. It doesn't follow the UN Geneva Convention. It doesn't follow any of these things. The NATO is an unhinged, completely unaccountable military alliance that is meant to reinforce and expand the American empire via its European junior partners. That is all NATO is. That's all NATO has ever been. NATO has never had a good purpose or a functional purpose. That's why the damn thing was staffed by Nazis in Operation Paperclip. The United States literally allowed German Nazis and Nazis across the European world to come and staff major positions within NATO for many years. I mean, we're talking about an institution that is literally just about military interests. It is just about militarism. And so NATO trying so hard here to conceal that and to explain it away is hilarious because they do a very bad job. I mean, the tone of voice alone is not convincing at all. You literally have to be someone who just kisses and licks the boot of militarism, right? Of the military industrial complex to be convinced by that drivel. Someone said in the chat that they lost brain cells. Well, you know, uh, that's the least damage that NATO can do, right? Because we've lost so much more because of NATO. We've lost entire progressive society. I mean, we're talking about NATO's participation in the debacle in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yugoslavia. I mean, we've lost civilizations. We've lost self-determination. We've lost uh, just so many lives, so many people, so many children, so many people have died because of these wars. And then, of course, the destabilization, turning the cradle of civilization, turning entire regions into just arenas of instability, right? Corporate theft, all of that NATO has facilitated. If brain cells is the most that we lose out of watching that, then I guess we can say that we are the least of the victims. But nonetheless, I mean, I feel terrible after watching that. I feel like I need to brush my teeth or something after watching that, or like wash my face, because it's just so abhorrent, right? There's just no getting around the fact that there is no moral grounding for NATO. There's no reason for it to exist. And we are seeing more and more how institutions like NATO, led by the United States, cannot help, right, but respond to the fact that there is nothing right now that's really providing cover for them other than their own propaganda apparatus, other than the fact that they continue to assert hegemony in member countries, right? They cannot escape the fact that NATO is not popular around the world. It's not popular in the countries that it targets. It's not popular in countries that have been able to escape NATO's wrath. It's not popular there, and it's becoming increasingly irrelevant and also unpopular among even ordinary people in the United States and Europe, because NATO is a budget grab. It's a complete and utter theft of the public wealth. All right, that's what it does. And these interventions are not really, NATO's interventions aren't really serving the interests of the the member countries' societies. Endless austerity generally tends to also produce war fatigue and a sort of resentment toward these institutions. That's why Donald Trump was able to talk about NATO in the way he talked about it, even flirting with pulling out. For as much as Donald Trump had no principles around that really were like leftist principles, right? We're not talking, he didn't care about peace. He didn't care about the damage NATO caused. He didn't care about any of that. It was a nationalist kind of dog whistle. But at the same time, the fact that he was even to whistle it has to do with the fact that NATO has lost a lot of legitimacy, and Ukraine gave it a temporary boost because there's all sorts of propaganda and the liberals were really, really enthusiastic. But in all fairness, this thing is dragging on. And that's why this video had to be released, because this conflict is dragging on. NATO has lost. NATO is not going to win. There's no war with victory for NATO any longer. Doesn't matter how much it talks about China. Doesn't matter how much it continues to pump weapons into Ukraine. It's a failed venture. And that is what the NATO has to look forward to. And people like Scott Ritter I've had on this program have said that another thing NATO has to look forward to is its potential demise. He goes as far as saying that NATO is going to fall. I don't know about that, but certainly NATO is going to weaken further and further and further. And so, I mean, I will celebrate no matter what conditions exist. I will celebrate NATO's demise like it's the best day of my life. any downfall for any part of U.S. militarism is an amazing day. That includes what happened in Afghanistan. That was an amazing day. I thoroughly enjoyed. I had a great day watching the Taliban sweep the floor with the U.S. military as they ran away, and watching people even like Marion Williamson. I had a great day watching all of that liberal hand wringing, all that desperation. That was a great day. Anytime that the U.S. empire is weakened is a great day. So we should all celebrate. So we should all be hoping for the downfall of NATO. All right. So I want to talk about one more thing, guys. So we talked about the empire has no clothes. I'm going to save a few things for tomorrow if I go on, which is a possibility. All right. It's a possibility I go on too. I want maybe a shorter one with a call-in attached. So that might happen tomorrow. All right. Because I don't know how much until the middle of next week. That time I'll have until like the middle of next week to come on. Well, but I'm doing this more often. So I want to talk about one more thing. That's Assata Shakur's birthday. Before I do that, right, like the stream, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, hit that notifications bell. And I'm 19 subscribers on Patreon, away from my 500 subscriber goal. So please do subscribe to my Patreon to support this channel, patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. It's how you sustain this work right here, as well as my columns and everything else that I do. Okay, so let's get to it, guys. It's Assata Shakur's birthday. Now, Assata Shakur has been a very influential force in my politics, my political life, especially early on. But, you know, that endures into today. And so her autobiography is incredible. You should read it. She's now 75 years old. So happy 75th to Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur has gained more prominence in recent years because of the Black Lives Matter movement. You see her quoted, "We have nothing to lose but our chains. We have a duty to fight," all of that. There's a whole slogan that was made out of her autobiography that Black Lives Matter activists or people under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter chanted. So Assata Shakur has gained more prominence. Her autobiography has become more popular, and that's a really good thing. Now, I do think that she's been sanitized a bit, that only certain pieces of her are talked about. But I'm going to pull up a piece that I wrote in 2019 about her. Creative experiences. I said, no, not Tupac's mom, Tupac's aunt. Afeni Shakur was Tupac's mother, and I believe that was Assata Shakur's sister. So Assata Shakur, yes, she does have a relationship to Tupac Shakur. So Afeni and Assata were both in the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Movement more so. So primarily Assata Shakur was in the Black Liberation Movement. She was arrested and imprisoned, I believe in 1977, and spent 2 years in prison. Actually gave birth in prison, I believe. And then she escaped. She escaped prison after the famous shootout with, I believe it was Sundiata Acoli. And, oh, man, he was just released from prison. Can't remember the other person who was involved in that shootout with the New Jersey police, New Jersey state troopers. But it's all in the autobiography. You should read it. But nonetheless, she escaped from prison in 1979. And then finally, after 5 years of hiding and running, she was given asylum, political asylum in Cuba. And she's been living there ever since. So Assata Shakur is a revolutionary. She's a socialist, Black liberation leader, someone who's very influential and should be appreciated for all that she has contributed, because she has contributed a lot, even just through her autobiography. But that's just the half of it. I mean, the legacy that she leaves and that she's left us is one that we should all be able to get behind, right? Because this is just a concrete figure, someone who is all about the collective liberation movement, all about defending the ideology of the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panther Party, socialism, the struggle against colonialism. And, she turned 75 today, and we should appreciate her. So I want to read an article that I wrote in 2019 in June, so about 3 years ago, just to give you a sense of sort of what I've spoken about, how I've talked about Assata Shakur. And so, as you should all know, the work, when you support me like on Patreon and whatnot, most of my years I've been writing since, I wasn't really a streamer until recently, last couple years, but I've been writing since 2013, 14, and most of that, if not 90% of it, 90 to 95%, pro bono. So, I supporting me is not just supporting the work that I've done, but also the work that I'm doing now, but the work that I've done. So Assata Shakur and the Long War on Black Liberation, right? I wrote this in 2019, and what's happened to Assata Shakur that you should all know is that the reactionary damn fascist, he's a fascist, Bob Menendez, senator of New Jersey, he has waged a campaign, a war, a campaign to capture Assata Shakur with the FBI. And so initially, there was a $1 million, $1 million on Assata Shakur's head. That was increased by Bob Menendez. I believe that was done during the Obama administration. So I'm going to read this article just to get a sense of how I've talked about Assata Shakur. And, I think it gives a good background of a lot of things, a good summary. So, during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, Assata Shakur's name saw increased recognition. A section of her autobiography was used as a slogan in demonstrations against racist policing throughout the country. Quote, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." This statement, while powerful, was unable to ignite a broad conversation in the Black Lives Matter movement or U.S. society in general on the plight and condition of Assata Shakur. As executive editor of Black and late Black Agenda report, executive editor Glenn Ford noted, the quote-unquote soft power of U.S. imperialism in the form of corporate philanthropy has played a significant role in watering down the politics of what is now a much quieter movement than what existed in the twilight years of the Obama era. This was before the 2020 uprisings. This was like 1 year before the uprisings in 2020. So at this time, the Black Lives Matter uprisings had basically dissipated, and we're kind of in that moment again. Yet Assata Shakur's current situation is a reminder that the U.S.'s long war on the Black liberation movement is far from over. Senate Democrat Bob Menendez and Senate Republican Marco Rubio have introduced a resolution in the Senate that demands for the immediate extradition of Assata Shakur from Cuba. The resolution comes as U.S. aggression toward Cuba has escalated in the form of tighter sanctions and travel restrictions. There is no better time for the lynch mob in the U.S. imperial state to intensify their hunt of Assata Shakur. The Democratic Party is seeking to regain the Oval Office from the Republicans in the 2020 election. Furthermore, U.S. imperialism has failed in its attempt to overthrow the socialist government in Venezuela. Gusano Cuba voters in the U.S. know that the fate of Venezuela is intimately tied to Cuba's and base their electoral decisions on which candidate is most hostile toward the Cuba-Venezuela alliance. So, of course, Assata Shakur is not merely a domino of the U.S.'s war against Cuba and Venezuela, because that's what really was happening here. That resolution was all about a dog whistle to the voters in Florida, to the voters of that region of the country who are all Cuban exiles, reactionaries, basically CIA attaches. And when they hear Assata Shakur, they think traitor. They think, they're racist. So they also think like black traitor, like someone who is a traitor to the United States and also in a country that they desperately want to see overthrown, a socialist country they desperately want to see overthrown. So, of course, she is a black revolutionary who's escaped from prison in 1975, has forever been an embarrassment to the U.S. ruling class. Assata has lived in Cuba under legal asylum since 1984, and since then, the U.S. has failed to bully Cuba into releasing her into the hands of the U.S. national security state. Cuba has made it clear that its loyalty resides with the dictates of international law, not U.S. imperialism. While few in the U.S. recognize the existence of political prisoners in the United States, Socialist Cuba has provided safety for Assata Shakur, in part because the Cuban people have firsthand knowledge that only torture, abuse, and death awaits her in the United States. Rarely in the toxic political environment of the U.S. is the question asked, why is Assata Shakur so despised by the U.S. state? The ruling class describes Shakur as a quote-unquote cop killer who needs to be brought to justice. What lies beneath the accusation is the U.S. imperialist war against the Black liberation movement. Dozens upon dozens of former members of the Black Panther Party have been accused of murdering police officers with little to no evidence and assigned to permanent incarceration. This includes Mumia Abu-Jamal, Sundiata Acoli, who was with Assata Shakur on the day of the shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike, and Russell Maroon Shoatz. Unfortunately, since the time of this writing, Russell Maroon Shoatz has died, and Sundiata Acoli was released, but it wasn't until he was fundamentally affected by the more than 40 years in prison that he served. So that happened just in the past year. That's what happens generally, that political prisoners not released until they're about to die, or that they are so medically compromised that their release, well, we're happy, is ultimately, we cannot help but see the impacts of what happened to them. So the question of innocence is not the principal contradiction in the lives of the U.S.'s prisoners of war. Innocence is a moral value that, when taken in the abstract, can fit the needs and interests of those who define them. Prisoners of war such as Assata Shakur were engaged in a struggle to ignite a revolution in the United States that would grant Black Americans and the rest of the oppressed the right to determine their own destiny. For this, they were brutally and violently attacked by the full weight of the police state. There has been no peace treaty in the U.S. war on the Black liberation movement, and the most recent bipartisan resolution to lynch Assata Shakur is an indication that the war won't end until imperialism is put to rest. So, think about this. There's a $2 million bounty on her head, and there's a resolution in Congress that wants to extradite her. The struggle to free political prisoners and prisoners of war is critically important in the larger goal of overthrowing the ruling capitalist oligarchy of U.S. imperialism and replacing it with a socialist system capable of meeting the needs of the masses. Assata Shakur's contribution to this struggle goes far beyond the popular slogan taken from her autobiography. Assata is a former member of the Harlem chapter of the Black Panther Party, and she would go on to leave the BPP and join the Black Liberation Army. The Black Liberation Army conducted guerrilla activities in service of the waning Black liberation movement. It was the principal force that freed Assata from prison. Black leaders such as Assata Shakur are feared by the ruling class in its entirety. Assata Shakur's continued suppression speaks to the enduring influence of the Black radical tradition on the political class in the United States. In 2013, the FBI increased the bounty on Assata's head from $1 million to $2 million US. Menendez and Rubio's resolution to extradite Assata is no aberration. It is another phase in the ongoing war on U.S. political prisoners and prisoners of war, a war that seeks to smother the flame of socialism and self-determination before it can gather strength in the current period. The case of Assata teaches new left organizers, scholars, and activists many lessons in the struggles to come. First, even though their names are rarely mentioned, the U.S. effort to murder and erase political prisoners such as Assata Shakur and her comrades continues into the present day. This means that the left must not only say her name, but also join organizations that are committed to fighting back against the ongoing effort to destroy and neutralize U.S. political prisoners. Second, Assata's historical trajectory shows the importance of developing solidarity with oppressed nations and people under attack from U.S. imperialism. Assata is not the only Black liberation that has been protected by the Cuban people. Robert Williams, Huey P. Newton, and Puerto Rican liberation activist William Morales have also received protection from the socialist nation. William Morales is included in the latest resolution to lynch Assata Shakur. With the U.S. on a path of endless war abroad, the left will need to cultivate relationships with organizations and nations to leverage the political power of the struggle for self-determination and socialism in the United States. Lastly, Assata teaches us that the technologies of the state used to destroy the Black liberation movement have expanded to consume the entire infrastructure of the U.S. national security state. U.S. imperialism has the most expansive military apparatus in human history. Every person within the U.S.'s colonial borders is a target of surveillance by the NSA, the NDAA of 2012, gave sitting U.S. presidents the ability to place an individual under indefinite military detention without cause or due process. 1 in 3 black men can expect to spend time in the mass incarceration regime in their lifetime. This is not to mention that the concrete war against the Black liberation movement has birthed a new program altogether in the form of the FBI's systematic targeting of quote-unquote Black identity extremists. As the newly organized Black Identity Extremist Abolition Collective points out, it is difficult to trace the impact of the FBI's Black identity extremism program. However, the mysterious deaths of several Ferguson activists appears to indicate that the program is fully operational and represents a serious threat to the lives of Black Americans across the country. Thus, the long war in the Black liberation movement continues. Both corporate political parties in the United States are loyal soldiers in the war. Menendez and Rubio's collaborative effort to lynch Assata Shakur is a show of force against the socialist nation of Cuba, which has steadfastly defended the human rights of U.S. political prisoners. The resolution is further rooted in the understanding that Black leaders such as Assata Shakur and Mumia Abu-Jamal present a dangerous alternative to the stagnant and dead-end political and economic conditions of U.S. imperialism. The ruling class will stop at nothing until the memory and lessons of the Black liberation movement are fully buried from consciousness. We must remember that the war on the Black liberation movement did not end in the 1970s and to stop at nothing to free our political prisoners. So that is the article. I just wanted to show it. I just wanted to read it because I feel like Assata Shakur is not really talked about at all. She trends now because she's become more popular, and I'm so happy that she's more popular. I think she should be more popular, right? I think that she should be read. I think the autobiography on Assata Shakur should be read. I think that it's a great thing that Assata Shakur is more well known, and that a lot of people know who she is, especially a lot of Black people, a lot of people of color, a lot of oppressed people in the United States now know who Assata Shakur is. But the campaign to allow her to live in the United States, to be with family that remains in the United States, the movement to free political prisoners is not at a strong point right now. And that is really, really unfortunate. I highly recommend everyone go to the Jericho Movement website. So just type in Jericho Movement. Study up on your political prisoners. Support them if you live in any of those areas. Support them. Write letters to them. Do whatever you can, right, to popularize them, to learn what they contributed, right? I think it's so important to do that and to connect them to Julian Assange. So for those of you who may watch this, connect it to the Julian Assange case, because there's a lot of people who support Julian Assange who also need to support political prisoners broadly. And I've always, I've done that. Maybe I'll share an article I wrote about Julian Assange in solitary confinement one day to show you just how I've talked about it, because I think it's so interconnected, right? Mumia Abu-Jamal is a journalist. These liberation movement fighters, they are all in their own right people who have stood up for the rights, for the freedoms of humanity, right, from imperialism. That's what they were doing. That's why they are punished. It's not about cop killing. It's not about any of that. It's not about that, all these evidence-free accusations or criminal charges that were all the product of a war. You talk to anybody, and I've talked to Dhruva bin Wahad. I've talked to many people who fought in that period, who were members of the Black Panther Party. They have always told me that it was a war. What was happening at that time was just look up 41st and Central 1969, what happened to the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party, the shootout that lasted more than 7 hours with the police. Look at what happened to Fred Hampton. Look what happened to Little Bobby Hutton. Look what happened to the Black Panther Party. Look what happened to the Black Liberation Army. Look what happened to the Black Liberation Movement as a whole. It was a war, and it's still a war. And that's what I conveyed in this article. It's still a war. It's reported now that Black people were stopped at a rate 6 times higher than white people in 2020 in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. This war continues. Jayland Walker, this war continues. This is a war. It's still a war. It's still a war. Look what happened to the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprisings. It's a war. The militarized police responses. Outside of Jalen Walker's funeral, you had military vehicles pulling up. That's war. That is war. The way he was killed, they kill you again, and they continue to kill you. That's that's the function of the police toward oppressed communities, toward Black people. That is the function of the police, an occupying force. It's an occupying force. It's a force of war. So Assata Shakur, 75 today. Salute to Assata Shakur. Her contributions to socialism, her contributions to the Black Liberation Movement, her contributions to the class struggle need to be remembered. Read her autobiography. Read all of the things she's written online, her speeches. Study up on Assata Shakur. Study up on her work, especially in a time where there is such a tendency to sanitize, to completely kind of wash over the actual ideas that Assata Shakur was promoting as she was active. She was actively fighting for the freedom and liberation of Black people and all people from this exploitative imperialist system. And so study those ideas, because when you study ideas of Assata Shakur, you learn that people like Assata Shakur were learning from revolutionaries, revolutionary theorists, communists, socialists. You learn that there's a historical thread that runs through the lives of all of us, right? That we all have a duty here. We are all part of a global socialist movement, and we need to take that very seriously and be able to continue to point out that thread. So salute to Assata Shakur. Of course, we miss her presence in the United States. Cuba is protecting her. Socialist Cuba is protecting her. And so salute to Cuba for doing that enormous duty and honor to the struggle for socialism by doing that. And we all have a debt to pay to Cuba. We have a debt to Assata Shakur, and we have a debt to all U.S.-based political prisoners. We have a debt that we have to pay, and it's a long struggle forward in that regard. But nonetheless, everyone, that's my tribute to Assata. So influential in my political development. Can't say enough about Assata, and of course the whole Black Panther Party movement. My introduction to socialism. It was my introduction to politics. I'm grateful for that, because we are living in a time where there's a lot of confusion on the left and a lot of difficulties talking about certain things like race that tend to be talked about either in in a reactionary terms on all sides of the political spectrum. And so Assata Shakur and others who come out of that Black radical tradition really help, I think, ground all of us, because they believe themselves to be an internationalist movement. I believe myself to be an internationalist movement. They grounded themselves in it. They grounded themselves as part of that broader global struggle, right? And that the struggle against racism, capitalism, and imperialism, we're all connected in the fight for socialism in the United States. That we have a debt to pay. That even just that phrase just has so many connections to what Assata Shakur and others have talked about in relation to the debt owed to the world because of imperialism, the debt owed to the formerly enslaved Africans, Black people, the debt owed to all colonized peoples, indigenous peoples, right? There's a huge debt owed that socialism, any struggle for socialism in the United States is going to have to wrestle with. So we can't negate that. We cannot negate that. It's a huge and fundamental mistake if we negate that for some kind of crass nationalism, which has no basis in socialist struggle within imperialist countries. It's the thing that Lenin and so many other communists have fought against, right? Narrow nationalism, the defense of the fatherland, right? This kind of reactionary bourgeois patriotism, which fundamentally romanticizes and renders exceptional the state, right? The contours of a society steeped and rooted in super exploitation, oppression, racial oppression, capitalist exploitation, right? That is something that we are continuously having to challenge, continuously having to fight, and continuously having to debate. And we should be talking about how to do that. And we shouldn't be, right, when we are doing polemics and we are debating, we shouldn't just be trying to thump our chest saying we're just right. We should be talking about what are the facts here? What are the historical facts? What are the things that we have to wrestle with, whether people are there or not? We cannot just say, well, people don't really understand that. Oh, well, look at what the woke language has done. Look at that. No. Just because there are political trends, reactionary political trends on a pendulum swinging back and forth, doesn't matter. That's just how bourgeois politics, ruling class politics works. We have to put politics in command of our movement, which means our politics have to be in command, and we have to be grounding them in revolution and then bringing those politics to the people with concrete organization activities. We can't just be on some kind of crusade for self-righteousness so we can get, I don't know, whatever, clicks, all of that stuff, clicks and hits, and maybe we'll go viral on Twitter if we talk about how much we love the American flag or some nonsense like that, right? No, that's not what we should be doing. We should be having real conversations if we're using this medium or other mediums, real conversations with the understanding that we are all fighting for socialism, right? Because there are some people who are disingenuous. Yes, we should not be us aligning or assigning ourselves to disingenuous neoliberals or whatever, rad libs or whatever we want to call them, who are not engaged in constructive socialism, constructive conversation along socialist lines. There are a lot of those, a lot of neoliberals, a lot of liberals in socialist clothing, right? There's a lot of that going on. So no, we shouldn't be aligning ourselves with that, but we also shouldn't be trying to placate reactionary trends politically on the other side of the political aisle either. That's just who I am. I would never do that. I would never do that because we have a duty to our class. And our duty to our class is not to just jump on any reactionary trend that is occurring inside or outside of our class. We have a duty to be the vanguard of our class, which means we have a duty to build an organization that leads our class. And while it's painful for people to understand, we can't just be tailing reactionary trends. That means, and you'll learn from Assata Shakur, that means you have to be out in front. That means you have to present something different. It doesn't mean you have to cater your ideology to what exists, right? You need to, of course, you start where people are, and then you have conversation, negotiation, and discussion based on what should be, not what is, right? So we don't, but if you take an opposite approach and tail everything, then you might have more success in terms of the business side of this, right? You might, maybe, you might. Some people do, some people don't. It's a dog eat dog world out here in the media sphere. So you may not. For me, I'm slow growth, all that stuff, whatever. I'm trying to put out a message, a particular message. So with that said, everybody, I'm going to go. It's late. I have got to, get ready for bed. Tomorrow, I'll probably be back on maybe late afternoon, probably, maybe early evening. And maybe it's definitely gonna be shorter than this, probably around an hour, hour and a half. And so, before you go from here, like the stream, like the video, hit the notifications bell and the subscription bell. Please do the best thing you can do to support my work. There are links in the description. Patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. It's the best way to support this work. I'm about 19 subscribers away from my annual goal. So please do subscribe there for any amount. It's very much appreciated. Patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. Please support. From there, tomorrow, I'll probably do a shorter one and link it to Colin because I need to do an episode with them. There's plenty to talk about that I didn't talk about today. So, yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night. Everyone rest up. Appreciate all of the support. And yeah, let's keep moving. All right. Salute to everyone. Bye-bye.